The morning sun cast long shadows across the corridors of Buckingham Palace as Princess and made her way toward the private wing where her brother Charles resided. Her footsteps echoed against the marble floors, each step measured and purposeful. She had always been known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties, her unwavering loyalty to the crown, and her deep devotion to family traditions. Today, however, something felt different in the air, a tension that seemed to permeate the very walls of the ancient palace, and had received an urgent message from Charles's private secretary the previous evening, requesting her presence for what was described as a matter of utmost importance regarding His Majesty's health and future arrangements. The cryptic nature of the summons had kept her awake most of the night, her mind racing through possibilities. Charles had been battling his illness with the same stoic determination that had characterized his entire life, but recently there had been whispers among the palace staff about his declining condition. As she approached the ornate double doors that led to Charles's private chambers, and noticed something unusual. The hallway, which was typically bustling with aides, secretaries, and medical staff, was eerily quiet. Only 2 guards stood at attention, their faces expressionless masks that revealed nothing about what lay beyond those doors, and had grown up in these halls, had spent countless hours in her brother's company discussing everything from state affairs to family matters. Yet today she felt like a stranger approaching an unknown territory. She paused for a moment, straightening her shoulders and preparing herself for whatever news awaited her inside. The relationship between and Charles had always been complex, built on mutual respect and shared duty, but sometimes strained by their different approaches to royal life, and had always been the practical one, the sister who spoke her mind without concern for political niceties, while Charles had learned to navigate the delicate balance between personal desires and royal obligations. The guard on the right stepped forward as she approached. "Your Royal Highness," he said with a formal bow. "I'm afraid His Majesty is not receiving visitors at this time." Anne's brow furrowed in confusion. "I beg your pardon? I have an appointment. Charles specifically requested my presence this morning." She pulled out her phone, showing the official message from the private secretary. "As you can see, this is an urgent family matter." The guard's expression remained unchanged, but it could see the discomfort in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Your Royal Highness, but my orders are clear. No visitors are to be admitted without express permission from Her Majesty, the Queen Consort." The words hit, and like a physical blow. Queen Consort. Even after all this time, hearing Camilla referred to by that title felt like a small knife twisting in her chest. Not because she questioned Charles's choice. She had long since made peace with her brother's happiness, but because of what that title represented in terms of the shifting power dynamics within the royal family. "I see," Anne said, her voice carefully controlled despite the storm brewing inside her. "And where might I find a Queen Consort this morning?" "Her Majesty is in the private drawing room, conducting meetings with the medical team and advisors," the guard replied, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, and nodded slowly, processing this information. Something was happening, something significant enough to warrant excluding her, Charles's own sister, from whatever was taking place. She had dedicated her entire life to the crown, had stood by her family through scandals and celebrations alike, and now she was being treated like an outsider in her own brother's home. "Very well," she said finally, turning away from the doors. "Please inform His Majesty that Princess and called and was turned away. I trust he will find this information interesting." As she walked back down the corridor, Anne's mind raced. She had seen the political maneuvering that came with royal marriages, had witnessed firsthand how new spouses could gradually shift allegiances and influence within the family structure. But this felt different. This felt deliberate and calculated in a way that made her stomach clench with worry. She made her way to her own office within the palace, a modest space that reflected her practical nature. Unlike some of the more ornate rooms used by other family members, Anne's office was functional and efficient, filled with files related to her numerous charitable patronages and royal duties. She sat behind her desk, staring out the window at the palace gardens where she and Charles had played as children. The phone on her desk rang, startling her from her thoughts. "Princess Anne's office," she answered, recognizing the voice of her private secretary. "Your Royal Highness, I have Lord Chamberlain on the line. He says it's urgent." "Put him through," and said, straightening in her chair. "Your Royal Highness," came the familiar voice of the Lord Chamberlain. "I understand there may have been some confusion this morning regarding your appointment with His Majesty." "Confusion is one way to put it," and replied dryly. "I was told that my brother is not receiving visitors without permission from the Queen Consort. Since when has that been protocol for immediate family members?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Your Royal Highness, I'm afraid there have been some changes to the access protocols due to His Majesty's condition. The medical team has recommended limiting visitors to reduce stress and potential exposure to illness. And I suppose the Queen Consort is exempt from these restrictions?" And asked, her voice sharp with barely contained anger. "Her Majesty is, of course, His Majesty's spouse and primary caregiver," the Lord Chamberlain replied carefully. "She is working closely with the medical team to ensure His Majesty's comfort and recovery," and closed her eyes, feeling a familiar frustration wash over her. She had seen this pattern before in other royal households, in other families where power and influence shifted like sand dunes in the wind. The spouse gradually becoming the gatekeeper, controlling access and information, sometimes with the best of intentions, sometimes with more complex motivations. "I want to speak with Charles directly," and said firmly. "Not through intermediaries, not through medical teams or advisors. I want to speak with my brother. I understand your concerns, Your Royal Highness, but that may not be possible at this time. His Majesty is undergoing intensive treatment, and how intensive?" And interrupted. "What exactly is his condition? I've heard whispers, but no one has given me a straight answer about what we're really dealing with here." The silence that followed spoke volumes, and had spent enough time in royal circles to recognize the carefully orchestrated dance of information control. When family members were kept in the dark, it usually meant that someone was making decisions that wouldn't be popular or that might be challenged if they were known. "I think it would be best if you spoke with the Queen Consort about His Majesty's condition," the Lord Chamberlain finally said. "She is coordinating all information regarding his care," and hung up the phone without saying goodbye, her hands trembling slightly with anger and worry. She stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the gardens where she could see gardeners tending to the rose bushes that had been planted during their mother's reign. Everything about this place was steeped in tradition, in protocols that had been established over centuries to ensure the smooth functioning of the monarchy. But protocols could be manipulated. Traditions could be used as weapons when placed in the wrong hands. And right now, Anne was beginning to understand that she was on the outside of a circle that she had always assumed included her by birthright. She picked up her secure phone and dialed a number she knew by heart. "Edward, it's Anne. We need to talk. Something is happening with Charles, and I think we're being deliberately excluded from information about his condition. No, I can't get in to see him. Camilla has apparently established some new protocol about limiting visitors. Yes, I said Camilla is controlling access to our brother." As she spoke with their younger brother, and found herself wondering how long this had been building. Had there been signs she had missed? Subtle shifts in family dynamics that she had attributed to natural changes as Charles settled into his role as king? Or had this been a deliberate and calculated strategy from the beginning? She thought back to family gatherings over the past year, trying to remember if there had been moments when she felt excluded or if information had seemed to be shared selectively. There had been occasions when she had arrived at family events to find that important decisions had already been made, discussions had already taken place, and she was simply being informed after the fact. The more she thought about it, the more she realized that this morning's incident was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern, a gradual erosion of her position within the family hierarchy. And if it was happening to her, the sister who had always been considered the most pragmatic and least threatening to anyone's ambitions, what did that mean for other family members? and had always prided herself on her ability to see through political maneuvering and court intrigue. She had watched her mother navigate decades of family drama and constitutional crises with grace and wisdom. But somehow, she had failed to see this developing under her own nose. The thought was both humbling and infuriating. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "If you want to know what's really happening with the king, meet me in the blue drawing room in 10 minutes. Come alone, a friend." And stared at the message, her heart rate increasing. Anonymous messages within palace walls were never good news. They usually meant that someone was afraid to speak openly, that information was being suppressed, or that political alliances were shifting in ways that required secrecy. She looked at her watch. It was nearly noon, and the blue drawing room would likely be empty at this time of day. Most of the staff would be preparing for lunch service, and the family members would be occupied with their various duties. It would be the perfect time for a clandestine conversation, against her better judgment, and found herself walking toward the blue drawing room. Her practical nature told her to ignore the message, to go through proper channels, to trust in the established protocols. But her instincts as a sister and as someone who had spent her entire life in this environment told her that something was seriously wrong. The blue drawing room was indeed empty when she arrived, its elegant furnishings and priceless artwork creating an atmosphere of timeless royal grandeur, and waited, her eyes scanning the room for any sign of who might have sent the message. "Your Royal Highness," came a voice from behind her, and turned to see Dr. Matthews, one of Charles's longtime physicians, emerging from behind a tapestry that concealed a servant's entrance. His face was drawn and haggard, as if he hadn't slept in days. "Doctor, what are you doing here? Shouldn't you be attending to my brother?" Dr. Matthews glanced around nervously before approaching her. "Your Royal Highness, I sent you the message. I couldn't speak openly through normal channels because I'm not supposed to be talking to anyone about His Majesty's condition without clearance from the Queen Consort," and felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean, clearance from Camilla? Since when does the Queen Consort have authority over medical communications within the family?" Since she was designated as His Majesty's healthcare proxy and primary decision-maker, Dr. Matthews said quietly. The paperwork was signed several weeks ago, giving her complete authority over all medical decisions and information sharing. The room seemed to spin slightly around, and as the implications of this revelation sank in, healthcare proxy meant that Camilla now had legal authority to make decisions about Charles's treatment, about who could visit him, about what information could be shared with family members. It meant that she, his own sister, had no legal right to know about his condition or to have input into his care. "How is he, doctor?" and asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Matthews looked around the room one more time before answering. "His condition is serious, Your Royal Highness. More serious than what's being communicated to the family or the public. The treatment he's receiving is aggressive, and there are complications that arise with this type of therapy." "What kind of complications?" "Cognitive effects, Your Royal Highness. Periods of confusion, memory issues, difficulty making complex decisions. The medications necessary for his treatment can affect judgment and clarity of thinking." Anne's blood ran cold. If Charles was experiencing cognitive difficulties and Camilla was his healthcare proxy, it meant that she was effectively making decisions not just about his medical care, but potentially about affairs of state as well. The constitutional implications were staggering. "Doctor, this is a constitutional crisis in the making," and said, her training in royal protocol and law coming to the forefront. "If the king is incapacitated, there are procedures that must be followed, safeguards that protect both the monarchy and the nation." "I know, Your Royal Highness. That's why I contacted you. Someone in the immediate family needs to know what's really happening. The Queen Consort is, she's managing information very carefully. The official medical bulletins are not providing a complete picture of His Majesty's condition," and began pacing the room, her mind racing through the implications and possible courses of action. Who else knows about this? About the true extent of his condition? Very few people, Your Royal Highness. The immediate medical team, of course, and the Queen Consort. A handful of private secretaries who handle the most sensitive correspondence. But even they may not have a complete picture because she meets with us separately and individually. This was worse than Anne had imagined. Not only was she being excluded from information about her brother's condition, but it appeared that information was being compartmentalized and controlled in a way that prevented even his closest advisors from understanding the full scope of the situation. "Doctor, I need you to document everything," and said firmly. "Every conversation, every decision, every change in his condition. Keep detailed records that cannot be altered or suppressed." Dr. Matthews nodded, but his expression remained troubled. "Your Royal Highness, I must warn you. The Queen Consort has made it clear that any unauthorized communication about His Majesty's condition will result in immediate dismissal and potential legal action for breach of confidentiality." And stopped pacing and looked directly at the doctor. "Are you more loyal to your medical oath or to threats from people who may be exceeding their authority?" "To my oath, Your Royal Highness. Always to my oath." "Then we understand each other perfectly," and said, "Continue to provide the best possible care for my brother, but keep me informed of any significant changes or decisions." "Can you do that?" "Yes, Your Royal Highness." As Dr. Matthews left through the same concealed entrance he had used to arrive and remained in the blue drawing room, trying to process everything she had learned. Her brother, the King of England, was more seriously ill than anyone outside a very small circle knew. His wife had legal authority over his medical care and was using that authority to control information and access. And, most troubling of all, there were cognitive effects that could compromise his ability to fulfill his constitutional duties, and knew that she was standing at a crossroads. She could try to work within the existing system to build relationships with Camilla and hope for more transparency. Or she could recognize that the situation required more decisive action, even if it meant challenging the authority of the Queen Consort and potentially creating a family rift that might never heal. As she left the blue drawing room and made her way back to her office, Anne's phone buzzed with another message. This one was from Camilla herself. "And, darling, I heard there was some confusion this morning about visiting Charles. Perhaps we could have tea tomorrow and discuss how we can better coordinate family visits during this difficult time. I'm sure we can work something out that serves everyone's interests. Love, C." And stared at the message, recognizing both an olive branch and a warning. Camilla was acknowledging that she knew about the morning's incident and was offering a face-to-face meeting to address it. But the subtext was clear. She was also making it known that she was aware of Anne's attempts to access Charles and was prepared to manage that situation as well. The game had begun, and was beginning to understand that she had been playing by rules that had changed without her knowledge. The question now was whether she was prepared to play by the new rules or whether it was time to change the game entirely. The elegant Wedgwood tea service sat untouched on the mahogany table between them, steam rising from the delicate china cups in the otherwise tense atmosphere of Camilla's private sitting room, and sat rigidly in the antique armchair, her posture reflecting decades of royal training, while across from her, Camilla maintained the practiced smile that had served her well through years of public scrutiny and family politics. "I do appreciate you making time for this conversation," and Camilla said, her voice carrying that carefully modulated tone she used for difficult discussions. "I know how busy your schedule is with your patronages and duties," and studied her sister-in-law carefully, noting the slight shadows under her eyes that suggested sleepless nights, the subtle tension in her shoulders that betrayed stress despite her composed exterior. "Of course, Camilla, though I must admit, I'm rather concerned about the circumstances that made this meeting necessary." Camilla's smile faltered slightly as she reached for her teacup, buying herself a moment to choose her words. "Yes, well, yesterday's misunderstanding at Charles's chambers. I do hope you'll understand that we're simply trying to follow the medical team's recommendations. Charles's health must be our absolute priority right now. Naturally, and replied, her tone carefully neutral, though I confess I'm somewhat puzzled by the new protocols. In my experience, family support during illness has always been considered beneficial rather than harmful. The words hung in the air between them like a gauntlet thrown down, and had always been known for her direct communication style, and she had no intention of dancing around the real issues that needed to be addressed. She watched as Camilla set down her teacup with perhaps more force than necessary. And, darling, I think you may not fully understand the complexity of Charles's current condition, Camilla said, her voice taking on a slightly patronizing tone that made his jaw tighten. The treatments he's undergoing are quite intensive, and the medical team has been very specific about limiting stress and external stimuli. External stimuli? And repeated, her eyebrows rising. Is that what we're calling family members now? Camilla's composure cracked slightly, revealing a flash of something harder underneath. That's not what I meant, and you know it. I'm simply trying to protect Charles during this difficult time. Surely you can understand a wife's concern for her husband's well-being. And leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving Camilla's face. Of course I understand a wife's concern. What I don't understand is why that concern should override a sister's right to see her brother, or why medical information is being filtered through you rather than shared directly with immediate family members. Because I'm his healthcare proxy, Camilla said, the words coming out sharper than she had likely intended. Charles signed those papers himself, giving me the authority to make decisions about his care and to manage information sharing during his treatment. There was, in thought, the admission she had been waiting for. And when exactly did this happen? Because I don't recall any family discussion about such a significant legal arrangement. Camilla shifted uncomfortably in her chair, her fingers fidgeting with the pearl necklace at her throat. It was several weeks ago when the doctors first recommended the current treatment protocol. Charles wanted to ensure that someone would be able to make quick decisions without bureaucratic delays. Bureaucratic delays? And repeated slowly. Is that what we're calling constitutional procedures now? The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Both women understood the implications of what was being discussed. If Charles was unable to make decisions about his medical care, there were serious questions about his ability to fulfill his duties as monarch. And if those decisions were being made without proper oversight or consultation with other family members, it raised even more serious questions about the constitutional protections that were supposed to safeguard the monarchy. And, Camilla said, her voice taking on a warning tone, I think you're reading far too much into what is simply a practical arrangement for managing Charles's health care during a difficult period. Am I? And asked, her voice deceptively calm. Because from where I sit, it looks like you've systematically isolated him from his family and taken control of information that affects not just his personal well-being, but the stability of the crown itself. Camilla set her teacup down with enough force to make it rattle against the saucer. How dare you suggest that I would do anything to harm Charles or the monarchy? I have dedicated my life to supporting him and this institution. I'm not questioning your dedication, Camilla. I'm questioning your judgment and your methods. And his voice remained steady, but there was steel beneath the surface. When the sister of the king is turned away from his chambers by guards acting on your orders, when his personal physician feels compelled to meet me in secret to share information about his condition, when medical decisions that could affect the constitutional functioning of the monarchy are being made without consultation. These things raise questions that go far beyond personal family dynamics. Camilla stood up abruptly, walking to the window that overlooked the palace gardens. With her back turned, she spoke in a voice that was carefully controlled but carried an underlying tension. You have no idea what I'm dealing with, and the pressure, the responsibility, the constant scrutiny. Every decision I make is analyzed and criticized by people who have never had a walk in my shoes. You're right, and said, surprising Camilla with the admission. I don't know what it's like to be in your position, but I do know what it's like to be part of this family, to have responsibilities to the crown that go back generations. And right now, I'm watching those responsibilities being compromised by what appears to be a power grab, disguised as concern for Charles's health. Camilla turned around, her face flushed with anger. A power grab? Is that really what you think this is about? And stood as well, facing her sister-in-law across the elegant room, filled with priceless antiques and royal portraits. I think you're a woman who has spent years fighting for acceptance and position within this family, and now you see an opportunity to consolidate power while Charles is vulnerable. I think you're using his illness as a justification for excluding family members who might question your decisions. That's absolutely ridiculous, Camilla said, but her voice lacked conviction. Is it? Then, explain to me why Edward was told his visit needed to be rescheduled indefinitely when he tried to see Charles last week. Explain why the medical bulletins being released to the family contain different information than what's being shared with the press. Explain why Charles's longtime private secretary was replaced without consultation with anyone in the family. Camilla's face went pale. How do you know about? She stopped herself, but the damage was done. How do I know about what, Camilla? About the fact that you've been making personnel changes that affect the functioning of the monarch's office? About the fact that documents requiring Charles's signature are being processed without anyone verifying his capacity to understand what he's signing. The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla sank back in her chair, all pretense of casual conversation abandoned, and remained standing, her trained diplomatic instincts telling her that this was the crucial moment in their confrontation. Camilla, and said, her voice softer but no less serious, I want to believe that you're acting out of love and concern for Charles. But what you're describing goes far beyond healthcare proxy decisions. If you're making choices that affect the constitutional functioning of the monarchy without proper oversight, you're not just risking Charles's well-being. You're risking the stability of the crown itself. Camilla looked up at Anne, and, for the first time in their conversation, her carefully maintained composure completely cracked. You think I wanted this responsibility? You think I asked for Charles to be this ill, for the treatments to affect his thinking, for the constant pressure of making decisions that could affect millions of people? And felt a moment of sympathy for the woman across from her, recognizing the genuine distress in her voice. But sympathy couldn't override the larger issues at stake. No, I don't think you wanted any of this. But wanting it and being prepared for it are different things. And right now, I'm not convinced that the decisions being made are in the best interests of Charles, the family, or the country. Camilla wiped her eyes with a handkerchief, struggling to regain her composure. The doctor said that too much input from too many people would confuse him, would make his recovery more difficult. They said I needed to be the single point of contact to avoid overwhelming him with conflicting advice and information. And you believe them? And asked gently, what choice did I have? When your husband is lying in a hospital bed, fighting for his life, and the doctors tell you that your decisions could mean the difference between recovery and something worse, what would you do? And sat back down, recognizing that they had moved beyond accusations and into something more honest and complex. I would ask for help. I would insist on second opinions. I would make sure that other people I trusted were involved in important decisions, especially decisions that could affect more than just Charles's health. But that's just it, Anne. Who can I trust? This family has never fully accepted me. There are people who would be happy to see me fail, who would use Charles's illness as an opportunity to undermine my position or exclude me from decisions about my own husband's care. The admission hung in the air between them, revealing the deeper insecurities and fears that had been driving Camilla's behavior, and began to understand that what she had interpreted as a calculated power grab might actually be the desperate actions of a woman who felt cornered and alone. Camilla, you're not wrong that this family can be challenging to navigate, and said carefully, but isolation isn't the answer. And right now, by excluding people who care about Charles, you're creating exactly the kind of opposition you're trying to avoid. Camilla looked up sharply. What do you mean? I mean that Edward and I have been talking. Sophie has been asking questions about why she can't visit. Even the grandchildren have noticed that access to their grandfather has become restricted. People are starting to wonder what's really happening, and in the absence of accurate information, they're beginning to draw their own conclusions. What kind of conclusions? And chose her words carefully, knowing that what she said next could either escalate the situation or create an opportunity for resolution. Some people are beginning to wonder whether Charles is more ill than we've been told. Others are questioning whether he's still capable of fulfilling his duties as king. And a few are starting to ask whether the decisions being made in his name are actually his decisions at all. Camilla's face went white. They think I'm making royal decisions without his knowledge. I don't know what they think because I don't have enough information to know what's actually happening. And that's the problem, Camilla. When family members are excluded from information about the king's condition, when access is restricted and medical details are kept secret, people fill in the blanks with their own theories. And some of those theories could be very damaging to both you and Charles. Camilla stood up and began pacing the room, her hands clasped tightly behind her back. The doctors assured me that his cognitive issues were temporary, that they were side effects of the medication that would resolve once the treatment was complete. They said it was important to maintain continuity in decision-making to avoid confusion. And you believed them because you wanted to believe them, and said gently. But, Camilla, even temporary cognitive impairment in a reigning monarch raises constitutional questions that can't be ignored. There are protocols in place for exactly these situations, safeguards that protect both the crown and the individual. But if we follow those protocols, if we acknowledge that he's temporarily incapacitated, it could damage confidence in the monarchy. It could raise questions about his fitness to rule that might persist even after he recovers. And nodded, understanding the dilemma. That's true. But the alternative, governing in secret while denying that there's a problem, is infinitely more dangerous. If it comes out that important decisions were made while the king was incapacitated, and that this was concealed from Parliament, from the family, from the people, the damage to the monarchy could be irreparable. Camilla stopped pacing and turned to face him directly. So what are you suggesting? That we announce to the world that the King of England is temporarily unable to make rational decisions? That we trigger a constitutional crisis in the middle of his treatment? I'm suggesting that we follow the established procedures for exactly this situation. The Regency Act provides for temporary delegation of royal duties when the monarch is incapacitated. It's been used before, and it exists precisely to avoid the kind of constitutional crisis you're worried about creating. But that would mean, Camilla trailed off, the implications sinking in. It would mean acknowledging reality instead of pretending that everything is normal when it clearly isn't. It would mean working with the family, with Parliament, with the established constitutional framework, instead of trying to manage everything in secret. Camilla sank back in her chair, looking suddenly older and more fragile than and had ever seen her. I was so afraid that if people knew how sick he really was, they would lose faith in him. I thought that if I could just manage things until he recovered, we could avoid all the complications and questions. And leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Camilla, I understand that impulse. But you can't protect Charles by isolating him, and you can't protect the monarchy by pretending that constitutional procedures don't exist. Right now, the questions being asked in private are far more dangerous than any official process would be. What kind of questions? And hesitated, knowing that what she was about to say would be painful, but necessary. Questions about whether he's still alive. Questions about whether decisions are being forged in his name. Questions about whether you've staged some kind of quiet coup while he's incapacitated. Camilla's sharp intake of breath told, and that her words had hit their mark. People really think that. Some people. And the longer this situation continues, the more those whispers will grow. Secrecy breeds conspiracy theories, Camilla. Transparency, even painful transparency, builds trust. Camilla was quiet for several long minutes, staring out the window at the gardens where tourists were taking photographs, blissfully unaware of the constitutional drama unfolding within the palace walls. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know how to fix this, and I don't know how to undo the mistakes I've made without making everything worse. And felt a surge of genuine sympathy for her sister-in-law, recognizing in that moment that Camilla's actions, however misguided, had come from a place of love and fear rather than malicious ambition. We fix it together. We start by being honest with each other, then we figure out how to be honest with everyone else. And if Charles doesn't recover, if the cognitive issues are permanent, it was the question that neither of them had wanted to voice, but that hung over every aspect of their discussion, and took a deep breath before answering. Then, we deal with that reality when we have to, but we deal with it openly, following the procedures that exist to protect both him and the crown. We don't pretend that he's capable of making decisions he can't make, and we don't make those decisions for him without proper authority. Camilla nodded slowly, tears streaming down her face. I've made such a mess of everything, haven't I? And reached across the table and took Camilla's hand, a gesture that surprised them both. You've made mistakes, yes, but they were mistakes born out of love and fear, not malice. And mistakes can be corrected if we're willing to be honest about them. Where do we start? And squeeze Camilla's hand gently. We start by letting me see my brother. The heavy oak door opened with a soft creak, revealing Charles's private chamber for the first time in weeks, and followed Camilla into the room, her breath catching in her throat at the sight that greeted her. The curtains were drawn against the afternoon light, casting everything in a dim, golden glow that made the elegant furnishings appear ghostly and insubstantial. Medical equipment hummed quietly in the corner, its presence a stark reminder that this was no longer simply a royal bedroom, but a sophisticated treatment facility. Charles sat in his favorite armchair by the window, but he looked nothing like the robust man who had been crowned just months earlier. His frame seemed diminished, lost within the folds of an expensive silk dressing gown that now hung loosely on his shoulders. His hair, always meticulously maintained, appeared thin and unkempt, but it was his eyes that struck in most profoundly. They held a distant quality, as if he was looking at something far beyond the confines of the room. Charles, and said softly, approaching slowly so as not to startle him. His head turned toward her voice, and, for a moment, there was no recognition in his gaze. Then, gradually, something shifted in his expression, like fog slowly clearing from a landscape. "And? Is that really you?" The sound of his voice, weaker than she remembered, but undeniably her brother's, brought tears to her eyes. "Yes, darling. I'm here." She knelt beside his chair, taking his hand in hers. His fingers felt fragile, almost translucent, and she could see the marks where 4 needles had been inserted. "How are you feeling?" Charles blinked several times, as if trying to focus his thoughts. "Tired," he said finally. "So very tired. The treatments, they help with the illness, but they make everything else so fuzzy." And glanced back at Camilla, who stood near the door with an expression of barely contained anguish. This was clearly more difficult for her to witness than she had let on during their conversation. Turning back to Charles, and squeezed his hand gently. "Can you tell me what's been happening? With your treatment, with your daily routine?" Charles's brow furrowed in concentration. "The doctors come every morning. They ask questions, but sometimes I can't remember the answers. Camilla helps with that. She remembers everything." He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time. "Sometimes I'm not sure what day it is." The admission sent a chill through Anne. Constitutional experts had long debated what level of cognitive function was required for a monarch to fulfill their duties, but there was no question that awareness of time and basic decision-making capacity were fundamental requirements. "Charles, do you remember signing papers recently? Documents that needed your approval?" His expression grew confused, then troubled. "Papers? There are always papers. Camilla brings them to me, explains what they are. I trust her judgment." He paused, his voice becoming smaller. "I should understand them myself, shouldn't I? I used to understand everything." And his heart broke at the vulnerability in his voice. This was the man who had spent his entire life preparing to be king, who had approached every aspect of his role with meticulous attention to detail, now struggling to maintain basic awareness of his responsibilities. Charles, it's all right. You're ill, and the treatments are affecting your thinking temporarily. That's not your fault. But the country needs its king to be strong, to be capable, he said, his voice rising with distress. Mother always said that the crown comes before everything else, even our own well-being. Camilla stepped forward from her position near the door. Charles, darling, you are strong. You're fighting this illness with everything you have. The doctors say that once the treatment is complete, you'll feel much more like yourself. Charles looked at his wife with a mixture of love and dependence that was both touching and concerning. Camilla takes care of everything, he told her. All the decisions, all the arrangements. I don't know what I would do without her. And felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. The man sitting before her was clearly incapable of making informed decisions about matters of state, yet he was still technically the reigning monarch. Every document he signed, every decision made in his name, was potentially constitutionally questionable. Charles, I need to ask you something important, and said gently. Do you remember giving Camilla authority to make medical decisions for you? He nodded slowly. Yes, I think so. The lawyers came, and they had papers. They said it was important to have someone who could make quick decisions if I wasn't able to. He looked confused again. But I signed them, didn't I? So I was able to make decisions then. You were, and confirmed. But that was several weeks ago. How do you feel about making decisions now? Charles was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. Sometimes things are very clear, like right now, talking with you. Other times, it's like being in a fog where nothing makes sense. The doctors say it's the medication, that it will get better. And when you're in that fog, when things don't make sense, who makes decisions for you? Camilla, he said without hesitation. She's very smart, very careful. She always asks me what I think, but sometimes I can't think clearly enough to give her a good answer. And look back at Camilla again, seeing the tears streaming silently down her face. The situation was more complex than either of them had fully acknowledged. Charles clearly understood his limitations, trusted his wife completely, and believed that he had made appropriate arrangements for his care. But the constitutional implications remained staggering. Charles, what kind of decisions has Camilla been making for you? He frowned in concentration. Medical decisions, of course. And she handles the correspondence that requires quick responses. She meets with the private secretaries about scheduling and public appearances. He paused, looking uncertain. There might be other things. Sometimes I ask her to handle matters when I'm too tired to focus properly, and felt her heart sink. If Camilla was making decisions about royal correspondence, about scheduling that might include constitutional duties, about matters beyond healthcare, then she was effectively governing in Charles's place without any legal authority to do so. Charles, do you think you're capable of fulfilling your duties as king right now? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Charles looked from and to Camilla, then back to, and his expression cycling through confusion, fear, and something that might have been relief. I want to be, he said finally. I wanted to be king my entire life. But right now, today, in this moment, I'm not sure I can tell you what the current political situation is, or what major decisions need to be made, or even what day of the week it is without asking someone else. The honesty of his answer was both heartbreaking and clarifying, and squeezed his hand again, her mind racing through the constitutional procedures that would need to be invoked. That's all right, Charles. There are provisions for exactly this situation. You don't have to carry the full weight of the crown while you're fighting for your health. But what about the country? What about the continuity of government? The government will continue, and assured him. There are systems in place to ensure that. Parliament functions independently. The civil service maintains operations, and there are constitutional provisions for temporary delegation of royal duties. Charles looked to Camilla with an expression that was both grateful and apologetic. I've put too much burden on you, haven't I? You shouldn't have to make decisions about things you weren't prepared for. Camilla crossed the room quickly, kneeling on the other side of his chair. "Charles, I've only been trying to protect you, to give you the time and space you need to recover without additional pressure." "I know," he said, taking her hand, "and I'm grateful." But, and is right, there are procedures for this, aren't there? Ways to ensure that important decisions are made by people who have the proper authority. And felt a surge of pride in her brother's fundamental integrity. Even in his compromised state, he understood the importance of constitutional propriety and the dangers of governing without proper legal foundation. "Yes, there are," she confirmed. "The Regency Act allows for temporary delegation of royal duties when a monarch is incapacitated. It's been used before, and it can be invoked again if necessary." "Would that mean I'm no longer king?" Charles asked, his voice small. "No, darling. You would still be king. But the actual responsibilities of the role could be delegated to a regent until you're fully recovered. Think of it as medical leave, but with proper constitutional safeguards." Camilla looked between and Charles, her expression troubled. "But wouldn't that create exactly the kind of public uncertainty we've been trying to avoid? Wouldn't it raise questions about Charles's fitness to rule that might persist even after he recovers?" "It might," Anne admitted. "But the alternative, continuing to make decisions without proper authority, hoping that no one notices the constitutional irregularities, is far more dangerous. If this situation comes to light later, if it's revealed that important state business was conducted while the king was incapacitated, and that this was concealed from Parliament and the public, the damage to the monarchy could be irreparable." Charles was quiet for several minutes, his expression thoughtful despite his obvious fatigue. "What would Mother have done?" he asked finally. The question caught Anne off guard. Their mother had faced many challenges during her long reign, but nothing quite like this. "I think she would have put the stability of the crown above personal considerations. She always said that the institution was more important than any individual, even the monarch." "Then, that's what we must do," Charles said with sudden clarity. "We must put the crown first, even if it means acknowledging my current limitations." Camilla's face crumpled. "Charles, I was only trying to protect you. I was so afraid that if people knew how ill you really were—" "I know," Charles interrupted gently, "and I love you for it. But we can't protect the monarchy by undermining its constitutional foundations." And is right. We need to follow proper procedures. And felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief that Charles understood the gravity of the situation and was willing to address it properly. Apprehension about the complex process that lay ahead and the potential consequences for all of them. "What happens next?" Camilla asked quietly. "Next, we need to have an honest conversation with the doctors about Charles's current cognitive capacity and the likely timeline for his recovery," and said. "Then, we need to consult with constitutional experts about the proper procedures for invoking the Regency Act. And we need to prepare statements for Parliament and the public that explain the situation truthfully but reassuringly." "Will I have to give up the crown entirely?" Charles asked. "Not unless the doctors determine that your condition is permanent and irreversible," and replied. "The Regency Act is specifically designed for temporary situations. If you recover fully, you can resume your full duties." Charles nodded slowly. "And if I don't recover? If this is the new reality?" And exchanged glances with Camilla before answering. "Then, we'll deal with that when we have to. But we'll deal with it openly and constitutionally with proper support and advice." Who would serve as regent? That would be determined according to the succession. Most likely William, as next in line to the throne. Charles considered this. He's not ready. He's still learning, still finding his way in his current role. He'll have excellent advisors, Anne assured him, and he'll have the full support of the family. No one expects him to handle this alone. "The family," Charles repeated, looking suddenly guilty. "I've isolated myself from everyone, haven't I? Edward hasn't been able to visit. The grandchildren have been kept away." "That was my decision," Camilla said quickly. "I was trying to reduce stress and potential exposure to illness. But it was the wrong decision, Charles said gently but firmly. Family support during illness is beneficial, not harmful, and the children especially should be able to see their grandfather, and felt a surge of hope. Despite the medication and the cognitive effects he was experiencing, Charles's fundamental judgment and values remained intact. He understood the importance of family relationships and constitutional propriety. "We can correct that," she said, "starting now, if you'd like. Edward has been very worried about you, and the grandchildren have been asking questions." Charles smiled for the first time since and had entered the room. "I would like that very much. I missed everyone terribly." Camilla wiped her eyes with her handkerchief. "I'm sorry, Charles. I'm sorry I kept everyone away. I was so frightened, and I thought I was making the right decisions." "You were trying to protect me," Charles said, squeezing her hand. "I understand that, and I love you for it. But protecting someone doesn't mean isolating them from the people who care about them," and felt tears welling up in her own eyes at the grace with which Charles was handling an incredibly difficult situation. Even in his compromised state, he was demonstrating the qualities that would make him a good king once he recovered. "So what's our first step?" Charles asked, looking between the two women. "Our first step is to call Dr. Matthews and ask for a complete and honest assessment of your current condition and prognosis," and said. "Then we schedule meetings with the constitutional experts and begin the process of temporary delegation. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we start being honest with the family about what's happening. We stop pretending that everything is normal when it clearly isn't. And we start working together instead of letting fear and secrecy divide us." Charles nodded slowly. "It's frightening, the thought of admitting weakness publicly. It's more frightening to pretend strength when weakness exists," and replied. "The British people are remarkably understanding and supportive when they're told the truth. It's deception and secrecy that destroys trust. Mother used to say that the crown only works if people believe in it," Charles mused. "And they can't believe in it if they don't trust it," and added. "Trust requires honesty, even when honesty is difficult." Camilla stood up slowly, her expression resolute despite the tears still streaming down her face. "Then we tell the truth, all of it, and we do whatever is necessary to protect the crown and the country," and felt a sudden surge of respect for her sister-in-law. Whatever mistakes had been made, whatever fears had driven questionable decisions, Camilla was now prepared to put the larger good above personal concerns. "Together," Charles said, reaching out to take both women's hands. "We do this together as a family." As the three of them sat in the dimly lit room, holding hands and facing an uncertain future, and felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. The path forward would be difficult and potentially damaging, but it would be honest and constitutional. And sometimes honesty and integrity were more important than avoiding short-term difficulties. The crown would survive this crisis, and realized. It had survived far worse. But it would only survive if they had the courage to face the truth and act upon it, regardless of the personal cost. 3 days later, the atmosphere in the palace had changed dramatically. Word had spread quickly among the senior staff that significant developments were imminent, though the exact nature of those developments remained carefully guarded, and found herself at the center of a whirlwind of activity as constitutional experts, medical professionals, and government officials arrived for a series of unprecedented meetings. The cabinet secretary arrived first thing in the morning, his usually impassive expression betraying hints of concern as he was escorted to the private meeting room that had been prepared for these sensitive discussions. Sir Geoffrey Hawthorne had served through 3 different monarchs and had witnessed numerous constitutional challenges, but nothing quite like this situation, and sat across from him at the polished mahogany conference table, flanked by Dr. Matthews and the palace's senior legal advisor, Sir Richard Pemberton. The weight of the moment was not lost on any of them. The decisions made in this room would affect not just the royal family, but the constitutional stability of the entire nation. "Sir Geoffrey, thank you for making time for this urgent consultation," and began, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "I'm afraid we have a constitutional matter that requires immediate attention." The cabinet secretary's expression remained professionally neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. "Of course, Your Royal Highness. How may we be of service?" And took a deep breath before continuing. "His Majesty's current medical treatment has resulted in temporary cognitive effects that raise questions about his ability to fulfill his constitutional duties. We need guidance on the proper procedures for addressing this situation." Sir Geoffrey's eyebrows rose slightly, the first crack in his diplomatic composure. "I see. And by cognitive effects, you mean?" Dr. Matthews leaned forward. "Sir Geoffrey, the king is experiencing periods of confusion, memory difficulties, and impaired decision-making capacity as a result of his medical treatment. While we expect these effects to be temporary, they're currently significant enough to compromise his ability to make informed decisions about matters of state." The silence that followed was deafening. Sir Geoffrey stared at the medical report that Dr. Matthews had placed before him, his mind clearly racing through the constitutional implications and precedents. "How long has this situation persisted?" he asked finally. "The cognitive effects became apparent approximately 3 weeks ago," and replied. "However, the full extent of the problem has only recently been acknowledged and addressed. And during those 3 weeks, how have matters requiring royal attention been handled?" And exchanged glances with Sir Richard before answering. "Her Majesty the Queen Consort has been managing correspondence and making decisions in consultation with His Majesty when possible. However, we now recognize that this arrangement lacks proper constitutional authority." Sir Geoffrey set down his reading glasses and looked directly at Anne. "Your Royal Highness, you understand that this is an extremely serious matter. If the monarch has been incapacitated, even temporarily, and this has not been properly addressed through constitutional channels, we are facing a significant crisis." "We understand completely," Anne replied. "That's why we're here. We want to address this situation properly, following all appropriate procedures, regardless of the personal or political consequences." Sir Richard cleared his throat. "Sir Geoffrey, we believe the appropriate mechanism is the Regency Act of 1937, specifically the provisions for temporary delegation of royal functions due to incapacity. We're seeking guidance on the proper procedures for invoking these provisions." The cabinet secretary nodded slowly. "The Regency Act does provide for such situations, though it has rarely been invoked. The process would require a formal declaration that the sovereign is incapacitated, supported by medical evidence, and confirmed by specific members of the royal family and government." "What exactly would that process entail?" Anne asked. Sir Geoffrey consulted a thick constitutional reference book that he had brought with him. "According to the Act, any 3 of the following persons would need to declare in writing that the sovereign is by reason of infirmity of mind or body incapable of performing royal functions: the wife or husband of the sovereign, the Lord Chancellor, the Speaker of the House of Commons, the Lord Chief Justice, and the Master of the Rolls." Dr. Matthews frowned. "That seems like a rather high bar. What if the sovereign's incapacity is temporary and expected to resolve?" "The Act does provide for temporary regency," Sir Geoffrey explained. "The declaration can specifically state that the incapacity is temporary, and provisions exist for the sovereign to resume full duties upon recovery." And felt both relief and apprehension. Relief that constitutional mechanisms existed to handle their situation, but apprehension about the public and political implications of formally declaring the king incapacitated. "Sir Geoffrey, if we proceed with this course of action, what would the public impact be?" The cabinet secretary considered the question carefully. There would certainly be significant public and media attention. However, the British people have historically shown great understanding and support for the monarchy during times of illness or crisis. Transparency and proper constitutional procedure would likely be viewed more favorably than any attempt to conceal or minimize the situation. "What about international implications?" Sir Richard asked. "How would other governments and diplomatic partners respond?" Again, Honesty and proper procedure would serve us well, Sir Geoffrey replied. Other constitutional monarchies have faced similar situations, and the international community generally respects transparent handling of constitutional challenges, and nodded, feeling increasingly confident that they were on the right path. Assuming we proceed with the formal declaration, who would serve as regent? According to the line of succession, it would be the Prince of Wales, Sir Geoffrey confirmed. William would assume the responsibilities of the regent, though he would not become king until the regency became permanent due to the king's death or permanent incapacity. Has anyone informed William about this situation? Dr. Matthews asked, and felt a stab of guilt. Not yet. We wanted to understand our options before involving him in what could be a very difficult and public situation. Your Royal Highness, Sir Geoffrey said gently, the Prince of Wales will need to be fully briefed as soon as possible. If he is to serve as regent, he'll need time to prepare for the additional responsibilities, and he'll need to be involved in the decision-making process. Of course, and agreed. We'll arrange a meeting with him today. Sir Geoffrey gathered his papers and stood up. Your Royal Highness, I must emphasize that once this process begins, it will be very difficult to reverse or contain. The public nature of the declaration, the parliamentary involvement, the media attention, all of this will create lasting changes in how the monarchy is perceived and discussed. We understand, and replied. But the alternative, continuing to govern without proper constitutional authority, is unacceptable. After Sir Geoffrey left and remained in the meeting room with Dr. Matthews and Sir Richard, all three of them contemplating the magnitude of what they were about to set in motion. Are we doing the right thing? Dr. Matthews asked quietly. We're doing the only thing we can do, and replied. The constitutional irregularities that have developed over the past few weeks cannot be allowed to continue. Even if Charles recovers completely, the precedent of governing while incapacitated without proper procedures could have lasting negative effects on the monarchy. Sir Richard nodded in agreement. The rule of law applies to everyone, including the monarch, perhaps especially the monarch. Anne's phone buzzed with a text message from Camilla. Charles is asking to see William today. Should I arrange it? And showed the message to her colleagues. It appears His Majesty is thinking along the same lines we are. She typed back, yes, please arrange for William to visit this afternoon. We have important matters to discuss. 2 hours later, and found herself walking toward Charles's chambers once again, but this time she was accompanied by William, whose expression reflected a mixture of concern and confusion about why he had been summoned so urgently. Aunt and Camilla's message was quite vague, William said as they approached the familiar doors. She mentioned that Father wanted to discuss important matters, but she didn't provide any details, and paused before entering. William, what I'm about to show you and tell you will be difficult to process. Your father is more ill than has been publicly acknowledged, and there are constitutional implications that we need to address. William's step faltered. Constitutional implications? What do you mean? The medication he's receiving for his treatment is affecting his cognitive capacity. He's having difficulty making complex decisions and sometimes doesn't remember important information from one day to the next. William stopped walking entirely. Are you saying that Father is mentally incapacitated? Temporarily, yes. The doctors believe it's a side effect of his treatment that should resolve once the therapy is complete. But in the meantime, he's not capable of fulfilling his duties as monarch. William leaned against the wall, his face pale. How long has this been going on? Several weeks. Camilla has been managing correspondence and making decisions, but she doesn't have the constitutional authority to do so. We need to address this situation properly. What does properly mean in this context? And explain the conversation with Sir Geoffrey, the provisions of the Regency Act, and the process that would need to be followed to establish a temporary regency. She watched as William's expression cycled through shock, fear, and, finally, a kind of grim determination. So I would become regent, he said finally. I would have to assume Father's duties while he recovers. Yes, it's not a role anyone expects you to want or to be fully prepared for, but it's the constitutional reality of our situation. William was quiet for several minutes, staring at the floor as he processed the information. When he looked up, his expression was resolute. What does Father think about all this? He understands the situation and agrees that proper constitutional procedures need to be followed. He's more concerned about the integrity of the crown than about personal embarrassment or political consequences. William nodded slowly. Then we do what needs to be done. The monarchy has survived worse challenges than this. As they entered Charles's chambers and felt a surge of pride in her nephew, the weight of unexpected responsibility was being placed on his shoulders, but he was accepting it with the same sense of duty and service that had characterized the best monarchs throughout history. Charles looked up as they entered, his face brightening at the sight of his son. "William, thank you for coming. I know this is all rather sudden and confusing." William approached his father's chair and knelt beside it, much as it had done days earlier. "Father," and has explained the situation. "I want you to know that whatever needs to be done, I'm prepared to help." Charles's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry, William. This isn't how I imagined your preparation for kingship would unfold. You should have had years more to learn and grow into the role gradually." "Father, no one can predict when they'll be called upon to serve. The important thing is that we handle this situation with integrity and proper constitutional process." "You're wise beyond your years," Charles said, squeezing his son's hand. "I'm proud of you. So what happens next?" William asked, looking between and his father. "Next, we begin the formal process of invoking the Regency Act," and replied. "It will require medical documentation, formal declarations from specific officials, and eventually public acknowledgement of the situation." William took a deep breath. "How long do we have to prepare?" "Not long," and admitted. "The constitutional irregularities that have already occurred make delay increasingly dangerous. The sooner we formalize the situation, the better." "Then, let's begin," William said firmly. "What do you need from me?" As and outlined the steps that would need to be taken over the next several days, she felt a profound sense of both loss and hope. Loss for the reign that Charles had waited his entire life to begin, hope for the strength and integrity that William was already demonstrating in the face of unprecedented challenges. The monarchy would survive this crisis, she realized, but it would emerge changed, tested by constitutional challenges that would ultimately strengthen rather than weaken the institution. Sometimes, she reflected, the most difficult paths were also the most necessary ones. 6 weeks later, the morning sun streamed through the windows of Clarence's house as Charles sat in his favorite reading chair, holding a cup of tea with steady hands for the first time in months. The cognitive fog that had clouded his thoughts for so long had finally begun to lift, leaving him with crystal-clear memories of the difficult decisions that had been made during his incapacity. The formal photographs from William's investiture as regent sat on the side table, a bittersweet reminder of the constitutional crisis that had tested their family and their nation, and knocked softly on the door before entering, carrying a folder of official documents that had accumulated during Charles's recovery. Her expression was a mixture of relief and cautious optimism as she observed her brother's dramatically improved condition. "Good morning, Charles. You look remarkably better today." "I feel better," he replied, setting down his teacup with a steadiness that would have been impossible just weeks earlier. "The doctors say that the last of the medication should be out of my system within the next few days. I'm beginning to feel like myself again for the first time in months," and settled into the chair across from him, studying his face carefully. The hollow, distant look that had characterized his appearance during the worst of his illness had been replaced by the sharp intelligence and awareness she remembered from before his treatment began. "Dr. Matthews says your cognitive tests have been normal for the past 2 weeks," she said. "He's prepared to provide medical clearance for you to resume royal duties whenever you feel ready." Charles nodded, but his expression remained thoughtful. "I've been thinking about that quite a lot, actually, about what it means to be ready, about what I learned during this experience, and about whether simply being medically cleared is sufficient." "What do you mean?" Charles stood up and walked to the window, gazing out at the garden where early spring flowers were beginning to bloom. And I discovered something during those weeks when my mind wasn't working properly. I learned what it feels like to be vulnerable, to be dependent on others, to have decisions made for me rather than by me. It was terrifying, but it was also educational. Educational how? I realized how much I had taken for granted. My cognitive abilities, my independence, my authority. When those things were stripped away, I had to rely on other people in ways I never had before. And I learned that vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean weakness. And joined him at the window. You also learned that the people closest to you were willing to make difficult decisions to protect both you and the crown, even when those decisions were painful for everyone involved. Charles turned to face his sister. Yes, and I learned that sometimes the hardest thing a leader can do is step aside when stepping aside serves the greater good. William has done an extraordinary job as regent. He has, and agreed. But he's also made it very clear that he sees his role as temporary and that he's eager for you to resume full duties when you're ready. I know he has, and I'm grateful for his loyalty and his service. But I've been wondering whether the assumption that I should automatically resume full duties is the right one, and stared at her brother in surprise. Charles, what are you saying? He returned to his chair, his expression serious. I'm saying that this experience has given me perspective on what it means to serve and on the difference between holding power and exercising leadership. For the past 6 weeks, William has demonstrated exceptional judgment, constitutional knowledge, and dedication to duty. The country has functioned smoothly under his leadership, and he has earned the respect of Parliament, the Commonwealth realms, and the international community. That's true, but he's also repeatedly stated that he's serving in your place, not his own right. The regency was always understood to be temporary. Charles nodded. It was, but just because something was designed to be temporary doesn't mean it has to be. The Regency Act includes provisions for a regent to continue serving if the monarch chooses to delegate permanently. And felt her heart skip a beat. Charles, are you considering abdication? I'm considering what would be best for the monarchy and for the country, he replied carefully. During my incapacity, I had no choice but to trust others to make decisions for me. Now that I'm capable of making my own decisions again, I have to consider all the options, including the option of choosing not to resume full duties, and sank back in her chair, trying to process what she was hearing. Charles, you waited your entire life to be king. You've only been on the throne for a few months. Surely you're not ready to give up already. I'm not giving up on anything, Charles said firmly. But I am questioning assumptions about duty and service that I've held my entire life. What if the most dutiful thing I can do right now is to recognize that someone else might be better suited to carry the full burden of kingship? William isn't ready, and protested. He said so himself when we first discussed the regency. He needs more time to learn and prepare. And he's learned more in the past 6 weeks than he might have learned in 6 years under normal circumstances, Charles countered. Crisis has a way of accelerating development and revealing character. William has proven himself capable of handling the most difficult aspects of monarchy with wisdom and grace, and stood up and began pacing the room, her mind racing through the implications of what Charles was suggesting. Charles, if you abdicate now, it will be seen as evidence that your illness was more serious than we acknowledged. People will question whether you're truly recovered, whether there are lasting effects that make you unfit to rule. That's possible, Charles acknowledged. But it's also possible that people will see it as evidence that I'm putting the needs of the country above my personal ambitions. The monarchy has faced challenges in recent years, questions about its relevance and effectiveness. Perhaps what it needs right now is not an aging king learning to adapt to new realities, but a younger monarch who is naturally suited to the demands of modern leadership. And what about Camilla? What about the life you've built together, the plans you've made for your reign? Charles's expression softened. Camilla and I have discussed this extensively. She supports whatever decision I make, and she's pointed out something important. We can serve the crown and the country in many ways. Stepping back from the throne doesn't mean stepping away from service. And stop pacing and look directly at her brother. Charles, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Are these thoughts coming from a place of genuine conviction about what's best for the country, or are they coming from fear about resuming the responsibilities you found so overwhelming before your illness? Charles was quiet for a long moment, considering her question with the seriousness it deserved. Both, he said finally. I would be lying if I said I wasn't apprehensive about resuming the full weight of kingship. The experience of having my cognitive abilities compromised was traumatic in ways I'm still processing. But that fear is forcing me to think more clearly about what effective leadership really means. And what conclusion are you reaching? I'm reaching the conclusion that effective leadership sometimes means recognizing when someone else can lead more effectively. William has demonstrated capabilities and instincts that I'm not sure I ever possessed, even before my illness. He connects with people in ways that feel natural and authentic. He understands modern communication and public engagement in ways that I've always struggled with. And he brings an energy and vision to the role that might serve the monarchy better than my approach would. And sat back down, her expression troubled. Charles, what you're describing sounds like the insecurities and self-doubt that often follow a serious illness, not like a rational assessment of constitutional requirements. You may be right, Charles admitted. That's why I wanted to discuss this with you before making any decisions. I need people I trust to help me determine whether these thoughts reflect genuine insight or post-illness anxiety. What does William say about all this? I haven't discussed it with him yet. I wanted to think through my own feelings before potentially placing him in the difficult position of having to respond to an offer he might not feel comfortable accepting or declining. And leaned forward in her chair. Charles, let me ask you something. Setting aside questions about William's readiness or public perception or constitutional procedures, do you want to be king? Charles met her gaze directly. I wanted to be king my entire life. The question I'm grappling with now is whether what I want is as important as what might be best for the institution and the country. Those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive, and pointed out. You can want to be king and also be the best person for the job. But what if they are mutually exclusive in this case? What if my desire to reclaim the throne is based more on personal ambition and wounded pride than on a realistic assessment of my capabilities? And stood up again, this time moving to sit on the arm of Charles's chair. Charles, you've been through an incredibly traumatic experience. Your judgment about your own capabilities may not be reliable right now, even though your cognitive functions have returned to normal. Which is exactly why I need to be very careful about any decisions I make, Charles replied. If my judgment is compromised by trauma or anxiety, then I shouldn't make irreversible choices about something as important as the monarchy. Then, don't make them now, and said firmly. Resume your duties gradually. Work with William to transition back into full responsibilities over time. Give yourself the opportunity to rebuild confidence and perspective before deciding whether to step aside permanently. Charles,